O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about The Call of Design, the excellence of ontological design by Daniel Fraga, and the battle we are all already fighting. Daniel Fraga has recently released a book. It is a magnificent book, and it is an important book called Ontological Design. And Mr. Alexander Bard, Dr. Cadell last, they wrote the preface to this book, and I thought it was a very good preface that really sums up a lot of the text. Now, certainly does not exhaust the text, because just the plethora of case studies, of examples, of lines of thought that Mr. Fraga explores is just very powerful. I think if anyone reads this book who doubts the case that Mr. Fraga is trying to make would struggle to continue to doubt it after they finish the book, which is quite an accomplishment. I think it's very difficult to write a book that makes a case that proves it. Basically makes the case very hard to deny. And Mr. Fraga, I think, has done a very good work, while also exploring a lot of angles on the topic. He's going to talk about some philosophically rich thinkers, Paul Virilio. He's going to talk about the apparatus, all of these different philosophical notions that I think is very important, because if in fact we are a constant project caught in a disorienting feedback loop with objects, to take from the preface that Dr. Last and Bard did, well, then we are constantly always making ourselves, and how we make ourselves and what we do with our day is very much relative to the ideas we have. I think it's a big mistake to think that it's possible to be a practical person who has not organized ideas, because practical is always defined by our idea of what we believe is practical, and so we are always operating, and our ideas of who we are and what we are is going to impact how we practice ourselves in the world and how we use objects. And if that is going to shape us, well, then we really need to own our ideas, because we're going to make ourselves in the image and likeness of our ideas. It's a feedback loop. But if we think of ourselves as beings, these kind of solid identities that don't change, then we're not going to think about ourselves as being transformed by our environments. And so we're not going to worry about the feedback loop that was so described. Well, that's very consequential. If in fact we're really more like becomings, as Mr. Fraga will argue in this book, then we are not solid identities, and so we are in flux, and so we are changing, and that's a mistake. For too long, we've been caught in this epistemological bubble, thinking that what we design with our knowledge structures has no real impact on the fundamental ontology of being itself or the world. Again, to borrow from the preface. It's not the case. How we think, epistemology always has ontological consequences, and ontology always has epistemological consequences. The whole True Isn't the Rational series is going to be exploring ontology, epistemology, ideology, how all of these things feed one another, and you can't really separate them. Well, likewise, the environments we are in, the technologies we use, impact how we think about the world, which in turn changes who we are. We have a paper on Hegel where we talk about the very fact that we can think a contradiction being a thing of which has no referent in the world. Contradictions are not in the world, and yet we're able to think them. Well, that says something about who we are ontologically as human beings. Epistemology has, in order for a certain way of thinking to be possible, there has to be an ontology of which makes that way of thinking possible. At the same time, the ways we think change who we are, and if technology and our environments change who we are, or change how we think, then they change who we are. This is really important. So Mr. Fraga really wants to pull out from under us an understanding of ourselves as having solid, unchanging identities, because that actually contributes to us being defenseless to the ontological design that is already happening to us, that is done to us by our technologies and our environments. If we think we are stable selves, we're not going to think there's any fight we need to put up, and so we're going to lose. The techno-capitalist object designs us, designs our very being. Thus, it is an ethical necessity for us to design ourselves back as an act of self-defense. Design or be designed. There is no other choice. And that's from the preface, and with that, Dr. Last and Bard prepare us for an excellent text that should be required reading for everyone alive starting now as of April 2022. At the heart of the book is a focus on that feedback loop I mentioned, on how by designing objects, spaces, tools, or experiences, we are designing human subjects. The book is a theory for architecting subjectivity and presents itself as hopeful. Yes, we are being designed and controlled by algorithms, corporations, corporations, governments, and the like, but we can fight back by taking ownership on how we contribute to our formulations as subjects. Running from our situation into isolationism would be easy. The real challenge is putting up the good fight. Mr. Fraga encourages us to take up that battle, though he is not idealistic about it, recognizing that design always affirms some things and denies others. Also, where we can design poorly, so there is a real risk here, but Fraga would encourage us to make this a risk we own for ourselves. Our lives are our lives, after all. In the series Belonging Again, we go through sociologists like James Hunter, Peter Berger, Philip Reeve, and these different people who talk about this balance between givens and releases. If humans are too free, they are existentially destabilized, but if they're not free enough, then they are oppressed and under totalitarianism. Today, we've moved away from givens into heavy releases. There are no mediating structures, plausibility structures, social orders, all these different things. We're very, very individualistic. The individual is very alone. Now, this leads to existential anxiety that can make totalitarianism appealing, hence why you have this return to popularism, totalitarianism, fascism, all these different things that is occurring. And what's extraordinary is thinkers like Hunter and Berger warned about this long ago, long ago, 80s, 70s, long ago. What Mr. Fraga would suggest, if we're following that line of belonging again, is that we can't go back to givens. And in fact, going back to givens would be a regression. And in the meaning crisis is a sign of hope. We try to suggest just that we're in a negative space now and we have to supplement to something else. We can't go back to, say, reestablishing givens. That would be oppressive. That would be failing the meaning crisis. What we have to do is learn how to supplement this negative space. And Daniel Fraga very powerfully suggests that owning and taking responsibility for ontological design is necessary in a world today that is so open, that doesn't have givens, where we have to create our own self-definition. Where there are no givens, we are also much more susceptible to, say, the ontological design of corporations or the government or different things. Let's say you were a Christian. Well, then the Bible would be a source of identity that would be over, say, the state and the corporations and so on and so forth. Now, of course, the state and the corporations would easily incorporate the Bible into their control mechanism, so I'm not saying it makes you immune, but there would arguably be a level above the corporate powers that people could ascribe to and avoid capture, Deleuzian capture, to use that phrase. Well, even if people are religious, today, under pluralism and globalization, following Berger and Reeve and all that, religions lose their plausibility. They lose their ability to hold us, to compel us. So we become weaker in our religious convictions, even if they are still there. Well, in that situation, the impact of technology to ontologically design us and corporations and so on is much, much greater, and the likelihood we'll be able to resist it is much, much weaker. That would mean we have to fill in the void, per se, with our own ontological design, with our own ownership of the creative act of which makes us, our being is becoming. We are not stable beings, so how we choose to be in the world will impact who we are and change what we experience. We are actively transformed by the world we are in on a very deep ontological level. Our spaces are not out there, independent from us. It's subjects. By designing our environments, we are designing modes of being. So Mr. Fraga is going to emphasize owning our environments, designing our environments, being aware of our technologies, creating technologies, and to think about creating objects, creating spaces as creating ourselves. And if we do that, well, then we have a plan by which to fight back against the forces that are trying to ontologically create it. We become curators, you could say. We become designers. All of us do. And if you don't do this, well, then you are going to be designed. It's, he says a great line, which says, design or be designed. There's no other choice. I love that phrase that he uses in the book. We are not stable as human entities. We are always designing modes of human becoming. We are not safe from ourselves. We are always in the business of designing how we become, because we are creating new technologies, creating new environments, creating new relationships, all of which influences and shapes the way that we become. This cannot be avoided, and we have to take it seriously. Something I appreciate about Mr. Fraga's book is how he makes a point to say this is not a happy book. That this is a tragic book where we've gained the ability to design ourselves. We're not bound by givens, but that also means we're at a greater risk than ever before. And this does bring to mind kind of Hegel's Progress that I talk about with Dr. Lass, which is where history is progressive or it's over. And what we mean by that is the future is always better than the past, but that's not deterministic. As history advances, the possibility of disaster, of things being the worst of all possible worlds goes up. So the future is it's almost like you can say the future is always better than the past or it's always worse than the past. There's really no middle. There's not really an entropy, which kind of sounds funny. But I think it's an important notion to consider, because we always kind of think about the future as progress. We always take progress to be necessarily progress, very determined. And it's not really the case. So likewise, the world of ontological design could be the best of all possible worlds if we rise to the occasion, but it could also be a disaster if we don't rise to the occasion. And Frege, in his book, there's this wonderful toward the start where he talks about, what's the difference between someone who has, say, Alzheimer and uses a phone to find his location and somebody who remembers where the restaurant is. So someone who uses a map versus someone who uses their memory. Is there really much of a practical difference between these two people? And the idea is that technologies, objects are extensions of ourselves. They, in fact, calibrate the directions we can go in, what we can think, what we can do. It's erroneous to think of technologies as accidental, as not really participating in our being, as something external, something optional. They are extensions of us, and in turn, we use them as they use us. You have that famous line that we make our tools and then our tools make up. Well, it's almost more like you want to say we make our worlds and then our worlds make us. But this is much more existentially destabilizing. I think we like to think of tools rather than worlds, because when you think of worlds, it sounds very overwhelming. It's very vast. But that's the case. We make our worlds and then our worlds make us. But how do we change the world? Well, we certainly aren't going to change it if we're not aware that we even need to do it. Mr. Frege will talk about Foucault, power, and power creates subjects. And, in Foucault, power is not merely force, say the direct shoving of a person into a wall. Power is the ability to look at someone and the mere glance has them do what you want them to do. Power organizes subjectivity. It creates subjects, is what Mr. Frege says. So we can think of technology and objects and things like this as exerting a power over us. They create our subjectivity. So if we're not creating our objects, then we're not creating our subjectivity. But the fact that we can create our subjectivity by creating objects means there is hope here. There is something we can do. It's just not passive. We have to be active. We have to do something. And, the other issue is that power designs, and design is never morally neutral. Wherever there's design, there's politics, there's ethics, there's a moral code of which is behind the design. So if we don't want to be living out ethical principles that aren't our own or that we don't agree with, well, then we have to get designing because our subjectivity is being formed, and it is going to be formed in the image and likeness of ethics. And if they're not ethics we share, well, we might be participating in an immorality that's something that we find immoral. I love also the line Frege uses, and he used it in our techno-social talk on Paul Virillo, and this idea that when we invent ships, we also invent the shipwreck. So yes, we create there's always arguably been ontological design, as long as there's been houses and objects and things like that, but now we're just reaching a new crescendo, a new extremity of the possibilities of ontological design, which means, of course, that there is the possibility of new catastrophe. If we can create an entirely new human being, well, we may make the human being something out of a Lovecraft story, one of the ancient ones, of which totally overwhelms and terrifies us. There's no guarantee that the gods we make won't be Lovecraft gods that are completely terrifying. But there's no option but to try to create something better, to try to design, because the war is on. The battle is on. Frege emphasizes this. It is not an option anymore not to participate. We are in the middle of the fight right now. And he does some great jobs, for example, of describing how, like the couch or the sofa, it shapes the way our body has become to the gesture of sitting. So now when I use the word sitting, we think of sitting on a sofa, right? So our understanding of what it means to relax is conditioned by sofa. Or if I say, have a good time, say if you play video games, you know, having a good time means go play the Super Nintendo or the NES or something. And so how we understand phrases and terms and things are shaped by our objects, and they work on that deep of a level. The word sitting, what comes to mind when we think sitting is never in a void or a vacuum. It is always conditioned. But we don't tend to realize that. We don't tend to realize how the sofa influences our very idea of what it means to relax. And that's an example of ontological design. And, you know, there's the play on that, you know, and Jung once said that people don't have ideas, ideas have people. You know, and so there's this kind of similar way that we live our ideas. You know, it feels like we think our ideas and then we live them. But there's almost always a background to ideas. The idea of rest comes to mean sitting in a sofa, and so it's like, oh, you have the idea. Oh, I want to go rest. I want to go sit right now, and you go to a sofa. Was that you thinking the idea? Yeah, in a sense, but that idea has been conditioned by the experiences of the sofa, and you could make a 1,000 examples of this. And it's also, he brings in this part where he talks about how naming was understood. To name something was not only a way to exercise power over that thing, but it was a way to frame it in a broader context. And, you know, we could talk about naming in the book of Genesis, you know, Adam naming the animals. There's something about naming that is ontological. Well, there's a way in which technology is now naming us. It's framing us. You know, if we were supposed to have dominion over the earth, it's more like now technology has dominion over us. And we're the animals being named now, as opposed to us doing the naming. But that can change. We just have to own ontological designing. Mr. Fraga will talk about apparatuses, which will be anything that works on our desires and flaws, from the Italian philosopher Agamben, I can never say it, Agamben, I think. And it's the idea that also, like, we as human beings are flows, we are becomings, we are desires, and all of these are shaped and oriented by our technologies, and we don't even realize it. Usually we tend to think that what we desire is an expression of what we want and who we are, but we very rarely appreciate how those flows of desires are themselves conditioned by technologies, and Mr. Fraga wants us to realize that. I also love how he critiques the book Nudge with Thaler and Sunstein, on the idea that Nudge is a kind of totalitarianism light, where you create environment, you know, in that book basically you're creating environments that help people choose the right kind of freedom. You're not taking their freedom, but you're showing them the right kind of freedom by creating environments or incentives or so on and so forth that makes them do what's good for them. And Mr. Fraga calls this as dictatorship light. And we can really think of the entire world now as engaged in a kind of dictatorship light against us, that because it is light, though, we can fight against it, but only if we realize we need to fight. And I couldn't help, while reading Mr. Fraga's book, but to think about Kafka. I always prefer thinking of Kafka versus, say, an Orwell or Huxley, where the oppression is much more direct. I think Huxley is probably more right than Orwell, where we're controlled by our pleasures. But I always think Kafka offers an incredibly important dimension to this. I tried to talk with the great Pei at Attention about how in Kafka it's what Mr. Fraga is talking about. It's very difficult for me not to see Kafka now as absolutely about ontological design, because the very subjectivity of, say, Joseph K. in the trial is contributing to his encapturement, how he is captured, how he is imprisoned. The protagonist is participating in and creating the very crime that he's trying to figure out what he's guilty of. So he doesn't know what crime he's guilty of. Well, he kind of makes it. He kind of creates it by how he interacts with his environment, and the different spaces that he is in are dreamlike, and he responds to them in a manner that gets him into more and more trouble. So we can see the protagonist of Kafka as being caught up in the totalitarianism and oppression of ontological design. I think thinking of Kafka and ontological design is very, very helpful. And I think that conversation with Pei hopefully fills in some of the blanks of that. But I also want to just stress how elegant the book is. Most philosophy texts are not elegant. I think Mr. Fraga is very elegant and very interesting. I really think you need to read this book. You need to buy it. Because it really just brings... It really brings to the forefront of how we are, in fact, already in the middle of a conflict, and that we are being shaped by that conflict. The technologies, all these things around us are capturing us. And Frege has this part where he says, all is story, and humans do nothing else but police each other's adherence to stories. Well, in the same way that sofa conditions what the word rest means, technology shapes and influences our stories, our self-definitions, and the ways that we think we're supposed to live our lives. And that's going to then convince other people to think of how we should be living our lives, and they're going to police our lives in terms of that technology. Everyone's going to become like officers policing the stories created by the technology to make sure everyone's adhering to them. We're all going to become one another's oppressors, per se. You know, Big Brother, if we want to use that Orwell language, we can say Big Brother is us. And that's what technology wants. You know, a very... the effective way to capture people is to make them their own capturers, and that's what's going to happen, and that is what is happening if we are not aware that the war of ontological design is on. You know, there's this part I really liked where he says the emergence of the noosphere, which is in reference to TR and this idea of the mind. You had the geosphere, the biosphere, and now you have the mind sphere, per se. And you can view this as a kind of massive planetary catastrophe, the simultaneous unification and clash of the human world with another world, that of the other. The other is the great unconscious, and it wants to have a conversation. I really like this because, indeed, where we can create, we are free. And where we can create, we have to ask ourselves, why do we want to create X instead of Y? And that forces us to confront our unconscious. Where there is freedom, there is increasing confrontation of the unconscious. So a world of ontological design is going to be a world that has to face the unconscious depths of ourselves, which can be destabilizing, create anxiety, and prove very, very difficult. And this is one of the reasons why it will be tempting just to let others ontologically design us, because we're not going to want to face that unconscious, which does in fact feel like the ancient ones in Lovecraft or something like that. But if we don't rise to the occasion and face our unconscious, face our desires and wills and the kind of beings that we actually are, then we can't win the war of ontological design. The corporations, the algorithms, they are going to win. Because if we don't face ourselves, then we're not going to be able to be free in a manner that proves productive, that doesn't prove just utterly deconstructive. And then we certainly won't design ourselves, and we won't participate in ontological design. So we have to rise to the occasion of combating and facing our unconscious. And again, another reason I think Mr. Fraga's work is so fascinating is because he covers this whole, the case feels very complete. You don't just talk about how technology is controlling us and stop there, like I think a lot of, say, many of the New York Times nonfiction books will do, just make a bunch of case studies about the main thesis about how technology shapes our lives. No, Mr. Fraga is going to be getting into philosophy, psychoanalytical thought, technology, all these different things, and how he's really going to be asking questions about how do we face the unconscious, what are the tools that we can use to lean into the madness, if you will, so that we can integrate ourselves with that madness and use it as a power, so that we can be better ontological designers. And that, I think, also entails integrating with lack. Ontological Design is an excellent book. I think it calls us to take courage and create ourselves. For all we claim we want to be freer and run our own lives, the truth is that the prospect can existentially overwhelm us. This will tempt us to quit. But Fraga makes it clear that quitting is to surrender our design to a different designer than ourselves. The battle is on. It cannot be stopped. Technologically augmented ontological design is the precondition for a radically new type of disaster, which simultaneously reveals new, potentially sublime possibilities of being. And I think Ontological Design by Daniel Fraga is an excellent call to arms to fight, to resist the forces that attempt to ontologically design us as opposed to we doing the designing. We can rise to the occasion. There's hope in this book, even though it is not a happy book, for it suggests that we do have what it takes to rise to this occasion. And if we do rise to this occasion, the future could be the best of all possible futures. We just have to put up the good fight, to fight, to seek, and not to yield. We have to design, or we will be designed. There is no other choice. But this is a choice I think we can choose well. For more by Daniel Fraga, please check out his work with Owen at Technosocial. Please get his book, Ontological Design, on Amazon. He has a great conversation with Cadell Last on Ontological Design on Cadell Last's YouTube page. And thank you so much for your time.